All right, so we got 3 sections to cover today. We're going to start with 5.1, which is tragedy of the commons. So this is just the idea that people are going to overuse shared or public resources because they don't directly experience the negative consequences of doing that. This can explain really complex ideas like air and water pollution and really simple ideas like dirty public bathrooms. Why isn't it? Okay, there we go. So your learning objective today is to explain the concept of that tragedy of the commons, and our FRQ practice will be explain environmental concepts and processes. So uh, this was really brought about by William Foster Lloyd, who looked at overgrazing of cattle or other livestock on shared public lands, which you can kind of see here in this picture. It's not cattle, it's sheep, but still livestock. So it pretty much says that individuals are going to use shared or public resources in their own self interest, which leads to degradation of those resources. Now, some key points here. Number one, it has to be a public resource, it cannot be privately owned land. And number two, it has to be degraded, overused, depleted, used up so that other people can no longer use this public land. If it was a privately owned resource, then we would feel the negative consequences of overusing it. So that's why it has to be a public resource. So some examples here are going to include things like overgrazing. So if we put too many cattle or livestock on a field, they're going to eat all the vegetation up, and then there's not going to be anything left for anybody else's livestock. Then we have overfishing, where people are taking too many fish from water sources before they're able to replenish themselves. Water and air pollution, again, is another example, and overuse of groundwater. Um, so even though this was first brought about by William Foster Lloyd, it really wasn't popularized until the late 1960s, 1968 to be exact, when Garrett Hardin wrote an essay entitled Tragedy of the Commons, which became very popular. Okay, buddy. So some reasons that this is going to happen is because if nobody owns the resource, so nobody owns the water, nobody owns the air, if it's public grazing lands, nobody owns that land, no one's going to actually directly suffer the negative consequences of depleting it. Think about when you go to a public restroom and you see, water splashed all over the sink or paper towels left everywhere. Because it's a public bathroom, those people who are leaving those messes in the bathroom don't have to clean it up. If it was their own restroom, they may be more careful and try not to make quite as large of a mess because they're going to be responsible for cleaning that mess. Another reason is that people just assume that others are going to end up overusing the resource if they don't. So if they don't graze their livestock, somebody else will, then the vegetation will be gone. So they might as well use it before somebody else does. This comic illustrates that pretty well. You can see this guy, he's kind of sad and somber about, well, there it is, the last fish in the ocean. But this guy over here says, woohoo, at least we beat the Russians and Spaniards to it. So he's excited to get the last fish before somebody else could get the last fish. And then many times there's no penalty for overusing these public resources. There's no, monetary loss. They don't have to fix it. So they just do what they want to do with the land. So the problem with this, we'll look at some specific problems. So for example, overfishing, that could lead to fishery loss, which is obviously going to cause, if you're a fisherman, loss of income. If you live in a part of the world that's especially dependent on seafood, even starvation. So you can see here we had a pretty stable fishery, and then it just crashed, and it's having a really hard time coming back up. Air pollution, for example, so that's another tragedy of the commons example. So That could come from our cars, from coal power plants, from all kinds of different places. And that's going to lead to things like bronchitis, asthma, which is going to cause increased healthcare costs in the long run. Pesticide runoff from farms can contaminate our drinking water. So that's another tragedy of the commons example. So, some ways that we can maybe try to solve this. Number one, create private land ownership. So, that could be individuals are owning the land, or even the government is owning part of the land. We can implement fees or taxes to be able to use the land. So, you have to have permits if you want to graze your cattle or your livestock, or if you want to log land. And then to make it even bigger impact, those taxes can then become things like fines or criminal charges for polluting shared resources. So some things that implemented those fines and criminal charges would include things like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act. So those will tax companies or fine companies, and then can also provide criminal charges. When it comes to grazing, the Bureau of Land Management, they are going to manage tons of acreage in the mainly western United States for cattle ranchers. And they kind of create like schedules and guidelines on how to graze your cattle and livestock for the greater good of everybody. Okay, so your practice FRQ here is that the oceans of the world are often referred to as a commons. Identify one other such commons, explaining how human activities affect that commons, and propose a solution for managing it. Then we're going to move right into 5.2, which is clear cutting, which is pretty obvious what that is. It's cutting all the trees in an area at one time. That could either be for lumber or to clear land for things like agriculture. So clear cutting is definitely, it's quick, it's fast, so it's going to maximize economic benefits, but it's going to have some pretty severe negative environmental impacts. So your learning objective here is to describe the effects of clear cutting on forests and describe environmental concepts and processes. So let's talk about some of the direct effects of clear cutting. So soil erosion is going to be the biggest direct effect. So when we start to cut down all those trees, we're going to see a lot of loss of stabilization in the soil because of the roots of the trees being gone. This is going to lead to more erosion, which is going to remove soil and organic matter, all those nutrients that are in that soil from the forest, because it's going to be eroded. And then that erosion is going to be deposited as sediments in local streams. That's going to warm the stream water up. It's going to make it more turbid. Turbidity essentially is just the total suspended solids in the water. And so with that, it can make it harder for fish to get oxygen because those sediments are going to clog their gills. It's going to make it harder for plants to get the sunlight they need because the water is just so cloudy. The next direct effect we have is increased soil and stream temperature. So when we lose those trees, the shade also that they create also is gone. So that's going to increase the temperature of the soil because soil has a lower albedo, so it absorbs more sun than the leaves did. So this is going to dry out the soil, which is going to make it more likely to be eroded. It's also going to kill beneficial microbes that are found in the soil. And then if those trees are found near rivers and streams, now our rivers and streams are also getting more sunlight. So we're having a higher temperature from the sunlight, and then the erosion of those sediments is also going to have that lower albedo than the regular water. So it kind of just snowballs and becomes a pretty not so good thing. Okay. And then flooding and landslides here is the last one on our direct effect slide. So when we have areas being clear cut, we're typically going to be using large machinery, which is going to compact the soil. It's going to squish it down. It's going to decrease that pore space in the soil. So it's going to hold less water. So it's holding less water. There's more sunlight, so it's drying that soil out. When we combine all of those things, we see so much more erosion of that topsoil. Now, all those things combined are going to decrease the water holding capacity. And so, if the water can't be held, we see two big things: we see flooding and we see landslides. So flooding is going to happen just because we have huge amounts of runoff now coming off of this area where the water used to infiltrate into the ground, but because the soil is compacted, it's now going to just run off. We can also see landslides happen because that soil is so compacted that and the rate of erosion is so high that when that rain really starts hitting, we'll just see huge patches of landslide of soil just falling away essentially. This diagram right here I really liked. It showed you how when we go out and we clear cut, you can see all that sediment, everything's going to end up right in this stream. But if we were to do something like selective cutting, where we leave a buffer here right on the edge of the stream, we still took out a decent amount of the trees from the slope, but as that soil erodes, it's going to get caught by these trees before it's able to get into that stream. So what we see happen with clear cutting is we tend to replace these old growth, high diversity forests with what we call a tree plantation. So that's an area where the same tree species are planted because they grow quick and they're able to be harvested over and over and over again. Now, that's going to be bad because it's going to lower our biodiversity. So when we have less species diversity, we have lower resilience. So we pretty much are making these areas very vulnerable to collapse from disease or natural disasters. If we plant all of the same type of tree and then somehow a new disease is introduced to the area, all of those trees are going to be affected and nothing's going to be left behind. When we do this, we also create less habitat for other organisms. In a mature forest community, there are multiple tree species there. There's different sizes of trees. There's the undergrowth. There's lots of different places and resources for animals to live and resources for them to use. But when we create these monocultures of just one type of tree, it really takes away a lot of that habitat. The other issue we see here is that all the trees are about the same age since we're actually going out and planting them. So that's going to lower biodiversity further because just like I said a minute ago, you're going to need those those variety of things in the forest for everything to survive. So here we're not going to see any true succession where we're going to see the older trees dying and being replaced by younger trees because the trees are all the same age. So this is going to further lower biodiversity because we don't have those trees dying, which are necessary for things like woodpeckers, different insects, decomposers. So once again, just kind of creates a snowball effect. So, some important benefits of forests for you to really truly be able to understand the negative consequences of clear cutting, you have to understand why forests are important. So, number one, they filter air pollutants. So, the stomata of leaves, which are just these little pores in the leaves, they're actually going to remove things like volatile organic compounds. Newt, stop digging at the couch. Nitrogen dioxide and particulate matter from the air, and they're actually going to store it in the tree. So you can see in this diagram, we've got those pollutants being emitted, creating smog, and those bad compounds are going to be absorbed by these trees. So they're actually going to like hold on to those negative materials that we don't want in the air. They're also going to do the same thing for carbon dioxide, but just a little bit differently. So Those volatile organic compounds, the nitrogen dioxide, the particulate matter, those are all going in through the stomata. With our carbon dioxide, that's actually going to be through photosynthesis. So trees are going to take in carbon dioxide. They're going to store the carbon as glucose, wood, bark, xylem, other tissues, and they're going to release the oxygen. So they're actually taking that carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas, out of the air. And then obviously, a lot of organisms live in forests, so they provide habitat, they help increase biodiversity, and then we can't forget about that ecotourism side of things. People are going to pay to go see these diverse forests. They're not going to pay to go see a tree plantation monoculture situation. So the consequences of taking down those forests, of clear cutting, we're obviously going to be reducing that air filtering and carbon storage service of the trees. And when we cut down trees, we're actually releasing carbon dioxide because we're going to have decomposition of whatever's left over. So you can see in this picture, there's a lot of times a lot of excess that gets left behind, branches, stumps. So as those get broken down by the decomposers, that's all going to be released into either the atmosphere or the soil. And then another really big consequence comes from slash and burn, which is a method of clearing land for agriculture. So when we don't really care about the timber or the lumber, we're just going to cut the trees down and we're going to burn them. And so this is going to release carbon dioxide, water vapor, and other greenhouse gases, which are going to contribute to climate change. So your practice FRQ today: describe 2 ecosystem services provided for humans by forests, and explain how clear cutting would affect each ecosystem service you described. So describe 2, explain 2. All right, and then our last section for today is the Green Revolution. This is going to be our longer section. So this was where we saw some major agricultural changes happening in the 50s and 60s, really worldwide. We saw the creation of high yield varieties, chemical pesticides, chemical fertilizers, industrial irrigation systems. So we saw a lot of things that helped to increase the productivity of our farms. This was a global effort to help prevent starvation in nations that weren't able to grow as much food. And this was really started by Norman Borlaug. He actually won a Nobel Prize for his work with high yield varieties, and he's credited with saving about 1 billion lives because of the high yield wheat varieties that he created. These were able to be produced in places like Mexico, India, Pakistan, and lots of other places that weren't able to grow these foods before. So even though this saved lots of lives, this is AP Environmental Science, so we do also have to investigate the negative environmental consequences that arose from the Green Revolution. And that's just Norman himself. So your learning objective today is to describe changes in agricultural practices. The suggested skill that AP gave us was text analysis, but we're actually going to do that in class. I do have an FRQ for the end of this, but sorry guys, mail came. All right, so Green Revolution, let's get right into it. So this was a shift really away from very small family-sized operated farms to these large industrial scale agribusinesses. So we saw the increased use of mechanization, GMOs, genetically modified organisms. We saw an increase in irrigation, fertilizers, pesticides. And these were all good because they greatly increased the efficiency of lands. So that increased short-term profitability and food supply because we were able to grow more food at a quicker pace. This actually decreased world hunger, and this actually increased Earth's carrying capacity. But it does have some negative consequences with it. So we see increased soil erosion, we see biodiversity loss, we see ground and surface water contamination from fertilizers and pesticides. So has a lot of great things with it, but also some not so great things. So the first one we're going to talk about is mechanization, which is essentially relying on machines to do work as opposed to farm labor being done by hand or by animals, which is much slower. So this is just the increased use of things like tractors for plowing and tilling fields, or combines for harvesting. So we're going to see increased yield and profit because we're able to get more work done in less amount of time. But this also increases reliance on our fossil fuels, because those machines are going to require some kind of fuel to run, whether it's gas or diesel. And those are going to create those greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, which are going to increase climate change. That machinery, it's really big if you've never seen it up close. And it's heavy, so it's going to compact the soil, which we already said is going to decrease the water holding capacity, which is going to make that topsoil more prone to erosion, which is not a good thing if you're a farmer. You need your soil to be able to grow your crops. So this idea of high yield variety crops, this is where Borlaug really did a lot of his work. And so he did his work by creating hybrids. So hybrids can be created by cross-pollinating either two different species or two of the same species that have especially ideal traits. So that's going to create offspring that have a higher yield, which just means they're going to create more of the desired food product than a normal variety of that crop would. So this was good because it increased yield and food stability in places that were prone to famine before, like India, Pakistan, Mexico, like I mentioned. There's just some pictures of him doing his work, okay? So we can either create these high yield varieties through hybridization or by GMOs. So with GMOs, we're actually going to be creating crops that have completely new genes that are placed into their genome that may come from a completely different species. So, for example, here you can see we've got this little diagram. So this would be an example of a hybrid where you have two parents. One has a characteristic or a trait that we really want, and we're going to cross that with another one in hopes. Sorry, this got cut off down here at the bottom. Oh, there it is. It's back. That the hybrid will have that disease resistant trait, but that's not always guaranteed to happen. Whereas if we take that disease resistant trait specifically and insert it into the crop, it's pretty much guaranteed to have that trait that we want it to have. So when we look at GMOs, there's a lot of talk around GMOs on if are they good, are they bad? And honestly, like most things, it's a mixture. There's some good things about GMOs. There's some not so good things about GMOs. So genetically modified crops have genes that are going to help protect these crops against things like drought or disease or pests, or it can also be a gene that's going to help them grow faster or have a larger fruit or grain to increase the yield. So this increases profitability because we're going to have fewer plants that are lost to those negative things like drought or disease. And then we're also going to have bigger plants and a higher yield per acre because they've got those larger fruits and grains. One example of this is BT corn. So it's being grown pretty much worldwide at this point. And it has a gene spliced into it that's actually from a soil bacteria. And that gene is going to create a protein in the corn that's going to protect the corn from most pests. It's completely safe for us to eat. It's going to save us time because we don't have to go out and spray pesticides. So this would be one example that would be incredibly beneficial to us. However, when we create GMO crops, they are all genetically identical to each other. Every single corn plant that's grown in these BT cornfields, if we were to take DNA from them, every single corn's DNA would be 100% identical to each other. So that's going to decrease that genetic diversity. So this is going to make our food supply really very vulnerable, because if there is something that's able to affect the plants, that they don't have a trait to resist against, so like some new disease or some invasive insect or something like that, then they're all going to be wiped out. Nothing is going to survive because they are all identical. Whereas if we had some of that genetic diversity and that disease or that pest came around, then maybe at least a few would be able to survive. But with our GMOs, if something knocks one of them out, it's more than likely going to knock all of them out. So that really is a little scary when we think about our food supply and all of them being knocked out because of a disease or a pest. So fertilizer is another thing here that we have to look at. So we really saw a shift from organic fertilizers, things like manure and compost, to chemical synthetic fertilizers that contain things like ammonium, nitrate, and phosphate. Now, overall, this isn't really too awful when you think about it, because it does increase yield and profits, because we're adding those limiting nutrients to the soil. We're adding nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, all these things that plants need to be able to grow. We're putting those in the soil directly. But these are pretty cheap, these fertilizers typically. So we see farmers sometimes using too much of them. And so they're being over fertilized. So when crops are over fertilized, we're going to see those nutrients being washed off into nearby waters, where they can cause that eutrophication, which we've talked about multiple times. So I'm not going to explain it here, but I did include a little picture for you to see an example of that. Those fertilizers also require fossil fuels to be produced, which is going to release greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, which is going to increase that climate change again. And then the last one we have to talk about is irrigation. So with this, we're just able to draw water from the ground or local surface water sources and distribute it onto fields to increase plant growth. We don't have to water by hand. We can use machines to do it for us. So this was really good because it increased the amount of arable land in the world. Arable land just means land that is suitable for agriculture. Many parts of the world used to be too dry, didn't get enough rain, so they weren't able to irrigate crops, so they couldn't grow crops. But with these new irrigation methods, they were able to get that groundwater or those surface waters and actually distribute it onto the fields themselves, so they could farm that land. But this can deplete groundwater sources, especially those long-term storage areas that are our aquifers, because they take a really long time to recharge. This can also lead to overwatering, where it's going to cause waterlogged soils, which can essentially drown the roots, which I know sounds crazy. How can they drown if they're in water? But they can't get oxygen. So if they can't get oxygen, it's essentially like they're drowning, okay? And this can also cause soil salinization. So a lot of groundwater is going to have small amounts of salt in the soil. And so when we put that groundwater onto our crops and then that water evaporates, it leaves behind the salt. The salt does not evaporate. So over time, that salt's going to accumulate in the soil and can eventually reach levels that are too high for plants to be able to survive. And we're actually going to do a lab on soil salinization to kind of demonstrate that. Oh, sorry, there was one more. I thought I was on the last one. It's getting ahead of myself. All right, pesticides. Pretty sure this is the last one. So as we see those synthetic pesticides being used, a pesticide is just any chemical that we're going to spray on crop that's going to target a pest. That could be either a plant, like a weed, that's going to be out competing the crop for the resources, like water or soil nutrients. But it can also be things like insects and rodents, which are actually eating or damaging the crops directly. Now, this obviously is going to increase yield and profit because we have fewer plants lost to those pests. But just like with our fertilizers, these can also run off into waterways and can kill or harm non target species that are found in our local soil or waters. And a big one here is our bees. Okay. Bees are pollinators, they pollinate a huge proportion of our crops. Um, I have a theory personally that if bees go extinct, the whole world is going to go extinct, because that's how much we rely on bees. Um, and these pesticides a lot of times target insects, and bees are insects. So, not a good combination. Some specific examples here would be things like DDT. This was a widely used pesticide before Rachel Carson discovered it. And she found that it was actually causing thinning of shells of bird eggs through bioaccumulation and biomagnification. DDT is what made the bald eagle almost go extinct, and it's actually been banned in most parts of the world. Atrazine is another one. It's actually still very commonly used, but if large enough amounts of it enter waterways, it can cause the amphibians and fish there to become what we call intersex, which means they have both male and female reproductive parts. Um, but they're also sterile, so they can't reproduce. So, not good. So, like I said, we'll practice this text analysis in class. So, today for your FRQ, your last one, all I want you to do is describe one environmental advantage and one environmental disadvantage of using genetically modified crops.